I'm Zachary Cartwright. This is Water and Food.
Today, my guest is Ian Fretheim at Cafe Imports, where he works as the Director of Sensory Analysis. In addition to working in the Quality Control Lab and processing hundreds of thousands of taste bud signals using his 7th, 9th, and 10th cranial nerves, Ian can also be found preparing, roasting, and cataloging green coffee samples. In this episode, Ian discusses his long-term observational study on water activity in specialty green coffee, as well as some new updates and insights since completing the study in 2019. Let's hear what Ian has to say on this episode of Water and Food. Ian, I recently came across your long-term observational study on water activity, and I thought you'd be a great guest for this show. And I was just wondering, where did your passion for coffee come from?
My passion for coffee really, I wouldn't even call it necessarily a passion. It's more of like I was prepped maybe by some teachers and some of the study that I'd done as a youngster in Buddhism, where I was really looking at details and quieting down and being an observer. And as I got this entry-level job at Cafe Imports, I was fortunate enough to have some really great instruction from the original people, setting up Cafe Imports, and they kind of turned me on to where I could be applying all this nearly useless training that I had done in a professional setting, which was really great. And so that in turn kind of sparked my interest, and then it's just snowballed from there.
And I see that you were ordained as a Buddhist priest, and you just brought that up a little, but how did that help you prepare for your current role at Cafe Imports?
Yeah, that's right. So before coming to imports, and especially the first half of my career, I was fairly heavily involved in Zen Buddhism, and before imports, I was actually very heavily involved in Zen Buddhism and am ordained as a priest. And the specific school that I was trained in has a lot of liturgy and a lot of meditation and not a lot of instruction. And so the expectation is, at least in more traditional and kind of rigorous settings that I've spent my time in, the expectation is that you just observe and kind of pick it up and learn as you go. And a lot of what you're doing is everything is choreographed. So it's really frustrating and inane. And it's like, oh man, incense stick needs to be 90 degrees, not 87 degrees, and all these little details. And you just learn to start observing them and appreciating them. And, maybe the end goal is a little bit different than what you might do in a sensory lab or in a sample room. But the underlying training is details matter, details matter, and details matter. So stepping into the sample room where typos is a problem, dropping a reference number is a huge issue. Um, Getting lazy about the difference between this coffee flavor and this coffee flavor has huge ramifications for the person that you're potentially buying that coffee from. So the crossover from the Buddhist training into the sample room, I mean, it's not essential, right? We've got some great people in our sensory program, and I'm the only Buddhist one. But certainly there was some translation that was really helpful and kind of set me up for some success here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm sure it was really helpful to learn to be able to kind of block other things out and really focus on the present and looking at what flavors or aromas you're getting. So that's really interesting that was able to help you. And so now you're in charge of sensory analysis of Cafe Imports, or what is your title?
Yeah, so my title is Director of Sensory Analysis. Cafe Imports is an importer. We have our main office here in Minneapolis, and then we've got satellite offices in Berlin, Melbourne, and San Jose in Costa Rica. And so my job encompasses the sensory, the cupping that occurs in all of those, as well as the organization of of the sample room. So sample reception, making sure that systems are in place to maintain the integrity of the chain of custody, I guess would be the best phrase for that.
And how many fresh samples are you going through every year?
Yeah, so we will be looking at roughly 6,000 fresh samples a year. When you market beginning of the calendar year, end of the calendar year, you're straddling harvest seasons.
Mhm.
And so if one season pushes a little late and one comes a little bit early, we could see 7 to 8,000 in a single calendar year. But roughly, I would say about 6,000 in a adjusted harvest year.
And you're looking at all 6,000 of those samples, you're looking at doing the sensory analysis and making notes on?
Yes. Yep.
Wow.
Everything gets run through physical analysis, which includes water activity, color,
Mhm.
shape, and size assessment, moisture content, density. Everything gets sensory analysis, which is through our cupping program. Everything is, of course, roasted and then has further physical analysis of the roasted coffee. So it's a pretty intensive life cycle for for a humble little coffee sample.
And the sensory analysis, is this with an internal panel that you work with, or do you ever do any like consumer testing with a larger group of people?
Yeah, so this is we're B2B, business to business, right? So we're an
Mhm.
importer, we're selling to roasters. So we're not really working directly with coffee drinkers of the world. So our sensory is all internal. It's descriptive. So I have to assume that people listening here will kind of have some understanding of the difference in sensory science between descriptive analysis and call it affective or preference testing. And really, what fits for us largely is a more analytic or descriptive bent to the sensory program.
And besides going through all these samples, what else makes Cafe Imports stand out among other companies that are doing something similar?
Yeah, so a lot of I guess what would be our competitors are truly massive companies in on this planet. And we are, for lack of a better term, we're kind of a mom and pop when it comes to importers and particular importers of our size and our volume. We came in at a pretty neat time. So it was prior to really anyone or very many people thinking about what's coffee, where did coffee come from. Um, we came into the scene and that just wasn't there, and we started importing someone's coffee, right? So that was one of the big things. Like, oh, this isn't just commodity. This isn't just a nice commodity. This is somebody's work product, and um, we did that at the right time. We got traction with that, and we've stayed true to that, for this all these decades, right? 30 years, 35 years later, we've stayed true to recognizing again and again, this is somebody's coffee. This is somebody's hard work. And now as a company, we've got maybe 70, 75 employees, I think. And uh, I I think we're also true to that internally. So we recognize that um, everyone in the company is doing hard work and finding ways to, we really try to find ways to make sure that our hard work is kind of holding up our end of the bargain as we're trying to buy coffee from people and then turn around and try to sell it to other people.
So it sounds like a great place to work and to be. I noticed that you also have a certificate in sensory analysis or something like that from UC Davis. I was hoping you could talk about that experience. Did that happen after you became ordained, or where in your journey did that
Mhm.
happen, and how did that help you get to where you are now?
Yeah, so I do. I have a call it a professional certificate in consumer and sensory science from the University of California, Davis. Uh, um, that happened after I was ordained. Excuse me. Um, and that came about. I went to a weekend workshop that was hosted by someone from Davis, and she mentioned this program was starting up, and so I went back and basically watched for the watched for it to come live when I could sign up, got myself involved, and since then it has really gone a long way to change how I approach things and how I understand things. Prior to that, I was a bit of an autodidact with regard to sensory science and, just reading textbooks and um, self-study with all that stuff and getting some direction, doing some coursework, seeing how it's applied technically within the field, within context was really helpful. Uh, in some ways, kind of like tempering my, more hardline, it needs to be like this, it needs to be like that kind of views opened up this idea like, oh, sensory scientists can be pretty pragmatic actually with regard to um, making sure the systems that they develop have applicability, have adoption, right? You could create a perfect sensory science testing environment, but if no one's going to adopt it, then it's not that perfect, right? You need to meet your client. In our case, our company is we're our own client as I'm administering the sensory program internally. But you need to figure out where your client is, what the realities of their business or sensory situation really are, and then it's your job, as the sensory scientist or the sensory admin person to devise the best possible test given the realities of where this where your client actually is. Right. So
And
everyone wants to have a descriptive panel with 20 to 30 people and
mhm.
close end testing where you get to spend 2 weeks on the same 10 coffees or whatever. But it's just like in our lab, we can't we can't spend that kind of time on the same coffees. We have new coffees that come in every single day, and we need to figure out ways to cycle through those, but still actually pay attention to every single coffee that comes through. And of course, in a company of whatever it is here, 75 people, we're not quite at the level where we can allocate 20 or so of those positions just to tasting coffee every day.
Since you're going through so many samples and you're doing this every day, every week, what things do you do to prevent fatigue? How do you stay at your sharpest, and how do you know that you're being able to analyze these samples correctly without getting maybe too tired and doing too many?
Yeah, it's a big challenge, and especially now as both myself and my lab manager, we've been working together for 12 years now, 11 or 12 years now, and when we started, we were doing far fewer samples, and now as we hire new people and onboard them into the cupping lab, we really have to step back and remember we've had over a decade of acclimation and kind of organically building our ability to deal with this many samples and deal with this much caffeine and this much coffee. And it's like really dropping people into the deep end when they come into the lab. So a big thing that we do that I've really been focused on as we've continued to scale and see more samples and also want to do a better job with um, say attending to those samples. A big thing that I've been focused on is refining our test procedure, right? So there's a big list of common sensory errors, and there's physiological ones and there's psychological ones. And these are not like good cupper, bad cupper errors. These are more like the troubleshooting manual for being a human sensory tester. And so uh, if you're at the table, it's kind of already a little bit too late, right? For most of these sensory errors, you need to design them into your test protocol in a way that assumes that they're going to happen and then controls for their impact when you're looking at what the output of a days or a weeks or a months or a year's cupping is going to be. So a a lot of my focus has been there actually on refining the testing protocols that we're using to minimize and control for some of these more common errors, including things like simple palate fatigue, right? They get more complex than that, but that's an easy one. You get tired. Yeah.
And talking about, setting up studies and protocols, you released a study in 2019 that was a long-term observational study on water activity in specialty green coffee. Where did the idea for this come from? Why did you want to investigate this further?
Yeah, I had some conversations with a couple people who I in coffee that I'd really respected, and had just done a little poking around, and it became pretty clear, in I guess we probably started this in 2014 or 15 is maybe when we started looking at the taking water activity measurements and really digging in. And at that point, obviously, if you looked at, I don't know, any other food industry sector that dealt with food safety, they were using water activity, right? Like if you looked at anyone who had any kind of process control in a system, water activity was involved. And this is not a unique situation for especially coffee, where like literally everyone else in the entire universe is doing something, and we're kind of doing our own thing until someone looks and says, "Oh, well, look, we're using moisture content to do something that everyone else is using water activity to do. Maybe we should look into that. Maybe we should explore that." So that's really where that came from. It just came from looking around for a minute and realizing that we were kind of missing the boat on water activity and misusing moisture content.
And how did you go about collecting data? What equipment or technologies were you using for that?
Yeah, so we got a water activity meter. It's called a 4TE Duo. Really neat little piece of technology. Not the fastest thing in the world, right? So you calibrate it, throw your sample in, and if you're lucky, you'd get it out in 5 minutes. If you were less lucky, 10, 15, or 20 minutes later, you'd get your beeps and you'd get your sample. And even when we started, we were still doing 5,000 samples a year. And so our entire workflow is set up for efficiency, and this water activity meter, especially the Duo, was a bit of a bottleneck. So we kind of worked out a post-processing phase where we would take all the water activity, and we just had this sample queue that would grow and contract and expand as we had time to get stuff through. Over the years, we had interns maybe spending the summer with us, and we could guarantee they were going to get a good chunk of time spent sitting at the desk and running samples through, recording them. We keep a spreadsheet at the time. Just take down the reference number, take down the water activity reading, double check the numbers, move on to the next one, over and over and over and over again.
What was your sample preparation like? Were you breaking open the samples at all, or are you just putting full samples in? What did that process look like?
So I'm not sure if I quite follow. I mean, we get sampled. Is this like a visual? Is there an actual visual component?
There may be a visual to this. So you can show it on your screen if you'd like to.
Yeah, so we get a little sample. That bag looks like this. If it were this full, this would be a great one. This is maybe just a little bit under a pound right there. Normally we'd get maybe 350 grams. The Duo would take, I don't know, 10 or 20 grams of green coffee. So we just drop the beans in a little sample cup and put it in and seal it up and press the go button, basically.
And the reason I'm asking that is, most readings shouldn't really take longer than 5 minutes. And some of that you can overcome it with the way you prep the sample. If you cut the interior so that the equilibrium happens faster. And so I was just a little surprised about the time that you read. But if you weren't cutting it open, this could cause it to go longer. And it also kind of depends on the cleaning protocol and those types of things. So I was just curious about how how those samples were going
Gotcha.
inside the chamber. What were some of the
Gotcha.
correlations that you found? What did you find from this study?
Yep. So let's see. We found that within the product green coffee, well, we essentially recreated the isotherm, right? Water activity, moisture content. We found there was a relationship. We found that it was not perfect. We found that it was, mild. We'd say like mildly predictive, give or take. Um, we found that how do I put this? We were hoping to find a silver bullet with water activity, right? Unrealistic, right? Similar when I was a kid, before I went snowshoeing for the first time, I had it in my mind that I was going to levitate 3 inches above the snow, and then I realized that I was still like trampling through the snow, and it's like, well, I'm disappointed, but it was an unrealistic expectation. What happened was we realized that our initial expectation was unrealistic, but we were taking this data and we were finding that the correlation to moisture content was not perfect. And of course, everyone was still using moisture content to do things that water activity was actually the direct control for. So we're talking about lipid oxidation, we're talking about mold, we're talking about, storage, warehouse control, that kind of stuff. And so we decided to keep going, and kind of pivoted our goal to really unpacking the relationship between the two measurements, and seeing what else we could find within water activity. So most of the stuff that we found within water activity, most of the correlations still matched up with moisture content. But with, I would say, a greater level of precision, right? In moisture content, ultimately, you're going to have to use a larger plus or minus with any statement that you want to make about it. Less so with water activity. And so now I kind of describe water activity as sort of a ground truth measurement, right? So if you're training a autonomous vehicle and you've got cameras and ultrasonics and radars and lidars trying to measure everything, that's really great, but you need to have some crazy system. And I don't want to mischaracterize water activity, but you need to have a robust, highly tuned, accurate system that you can measure everything off of, right? So that would be the ground truth. And in a lot of ways, we still take water activity on every sample that comes through, even if we're no longer rigorously pursuing new information from it. We're still measuring it. And every time I get a question back from a customer of ours or a coffee supplier with regard to quality or with regard to, hey, I think this moisture content is too high, or what happened to this coffee, water activity is still probably the first thing I go into the spreadsheet and look for is, okay, well, what was the water activity when we first saw it? What happened to it a month later? What's the story that unfolded with the water activity? Did it make sense what I'm hearing about the moisture content, right? So sometimes someone will come and say, well, I think your moisture content meter is broken. And I'll say, well, that's quite possible. I mean, moisture content meters are using formulas, they're using algorithms, they have different, they measure differently. Very few people are actually using the oven method. I mean, we're not using the oven method to take moisture content. But then I'll go back and look, and because of having this history of water activity and this understanding of the general correlation, it makes us very comfortable with regard to, our moisture content reading does make sense. It is tracking not just with what we're observing in the coffee, but it's tracking with where we expect it to be with regard to what we've read this many times on the water activity set.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that you said, you tried to correlate water activity and moisture content, and you kind of got an isotherm, but it maybe wasn't as smooth as you were hoping. And I think some of that comes from the inherent variability in whatever moisture content method you use. There are some newer isotherm technologies like the dynamic dew point isotherm that uses a dew point measurement for the water activity, just like your 4TE Duo. But then it looks at weight change and uses a starting initial moisture content to calculate based on weight change back to moisture. And this can actually allow you to get a really smooth curve. And I have one later that I'll send to you because I think that would be kind of helpful and insightful to you. A few things that stood out to me in your study, I noticed that you mentioned that there was a correlation between water activity and Maillard browning reactions, and that higher water activities led to increased browning. And we see that in lots of other products as well, but I thought that was interesting. And then you also recommended some storage conditions for green coffee, and I just was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. What are the storage conditions that you recommend?
Yeah, so let's see. Oh, we'll circle back maybe to the Maillard stuff because that's kind of an interesting thing, and it's actually a question that I have for you that I'd like to get I'd like to get some clarification on. But storage conditions, one of the things that was really fascinating to me that I didn't know coming in was the relationship between relative humidity and water activity number. If I've understood this correctly, 60% relative humidity is 0.6000 water activity. So that was a great kind of aha, like it's pretty simple, but until you know it, you don't know it, you don't realize it.
Right.
And everyone, you've got, how do you store coffee? Well, keep it dry, keep it cool, keep it clean. None of that is new, but introducing water activity measurement, understanding that water activity is dependent on or is tied to temperature. So your measurements are your carrying capacity, just like relative humidity, your carrying capacity is tied to temperature. Realizing that these things are all knit together and interconnected and are not just old rules of thumb are I think that was a bit of a turning point or a bit of an insight for us with regard to storage. So with that being said, what we've measured in specialty coffee is that call it 0.6100 seems to be a critical level for specialty green coffee. Above that, we're going to start to see from an observational perspective, we're going to start to see all of the water activity controlled reactions really ramp up. I don't think green coffee is particularly unique in that regard. Below that, I think we start to see a little bit more stability. And so while we're not going to try to store coffee in a 30% humidity environment, we're definitely gonna try to keep it down below 60 maybe in that 60 and 50% range with sub 70 Fahrenheit type temperatures. A little twist that has been also of interest is that over the course of this study, a technology or a bagging protocol called GrainPro came strongly online in the coffee world. It already existed, of course, but it went from being fairly common to being pretty much almost every lot is GrainPro at this point. And GrainPro is just a big plastic bag essentially, and it does a fantastic job of excluding that environmental moisture or humidity from interacting with the coffee. Now, there's some question about, if you pack too wet of a coffee or too active of a coffee in a GrainPro bag, and then you subject it to temperature swings, because GrainPro will not protect against temperature swings. At that point, then you might still have some stuff to look at with regard to coffee respiration and then condensation inside the bag, and then adsorption and all kinds of neat stuff like that.
Yeah, I'd be really interested to know the water vapor transmission rate of those bags, because if we knew that, we could actually investigate and run some simulations and under different conditions understand if the water activity is going to shift around or not, or the temperature, like you mentioned, if this sits somewhere where the temperature is higher, then the water activity is going to increase. But that's something that's actually really predictable, and possibly we can look more into that in the
Yeah.
future. And I just wanted to add on, I think the moment that you have where, the relative humidity is the water activity, a lot of people have this. There are certain industries where we primarily talk in terms of relative humidity, especially in like pharmaceuticals, for example, because
Okay.
it just
Huh.
makes better sense to them. That's what they're used to. But you're exactly right. Any food sample, whether it's coffee or something else, it has its own relative humidity. So when we put it in a closed chamber, it creates a relative humidity in that space. And when it comes to storage, I think it's important to understand that the food sample wants to come to equilibrium with the surrounding environment. So if you set
Sure.
it at an environment that is 60% relative humidity, even if the coffee sample is higher in water activity, if you give it enough time, it will slowly come to equilibrium and settle at 0.6. And so I think that's really important to your industry and lots of industries when we think about how to store things and what our target water activities are.
Yeah. Um, can I ask you a question?
Of course.
This has to do with Maillard. So water
Okay.
activity is a controller of Maillard spoilage.
Hmm.
So as I've understood that, we're going to talk about room temperature or
Hmm.
relatively room temperature browning reactions that are going to occur non-enzymatically via um, well, I don't know via what, but I know that this Maillard spoilage is controlled by water activity. And
Hmm.
in coffee, we roast coffee, and just
Hmm.
like baking bread or just like searing a steak, we have non-enzymatic Maillard browning. Um, I think a number of people, and I'm not sure if they're the one, I don't think they're the ones who are correct, but maybe they are. And maybe I'm going to learn something here. I think a number of people have taken one to one the browning that occurs in cooking or roasting and the browning that occurs in Maillard spoilage as as being the same. Um, I've thought that it is not the same just because of the kind of radical or violent amount of heat that is thrown at coffee or bread while baking or roasting, where in coffee we've got you drop a coffee into the roaster at 12% moisture, 0.6000 water activity, and the first phase is it dries out. And if you then take the coffee out of the roaster, you know, at the point where it's dry, it's not started Maillard, it's still green, but barely
Hmm.
green. It's like faded out. If you take it out, let it cool, come to room temp, take another moisture and water activity reading, there's not any moisture left and there's not any water activity left. And so it's hard for me to see how a coffee that starts green with a higher water activity is going to do anything differently in a roaster than a coffee that starts green with a slightly lower water activity, apart from requiring a little bit more energy to dry the moisture out of the coffee.
Right. I don't see a big difference with your starting water activity. I think that the browning that we're getting, especially from the heat exposure, is really different than if we sit something out and allow those reactions to happen over time. Where water activity really comes into play with browning reactions is that browning reaction rates are affected by the water activity level. So if we go really low in water activity, there's not much water available to help constituents or different chemicals to come together and go through those browning reactions. As we start
Yeah.
to add water activity, usually up to about a 0.6 range, this is really optimal for Maillard reactions because now you're allowing some fluidity and some movement so that these things can react and brown. But if we went even higher in water activity, then you start to dilute, and this is when reactions slow down again. So a lot of
Okay.
reaction rates beyond just browning, lipid oxidation or
Yep.
degradation of certain constituents, these are also affected by water activity, but browning especially has been really well defined, and it makes sense that the observations that you made. But again, I think that the browning that we see from the heating versus just sitting there and spoilage or just sitting out are going to be two different processes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thanks for verifying. Thanks for verifying that. It's actually a strange thing to try to, open up Google Scholar and try to keyword papers to talk about this very specific different. You can read a lot about Maillard spoilage, and you can read a lot about heat applied browning, but strangely challenging to find someone just flat out talking about both simultaneously. This is what one is, and this is what the other is. This is why they are or are not the same.
And maybe if somebody listening to this happens to be doing a study or knows more about this, we'd be happy to learn about it. So maybe this will result in a clear answer. Since you finished that study, have you continued to do any research, or are there any new observations that you've come up with since you released that study?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, we have continued to take our water activity readings. We continue to reference them and use them sort of as one of the first places that we go. We're not currently doing any direct study with regard to water activity or anything new. It's one of the automatic kind of like include it in the query if you're going to run a ANOVA or something like that. It's like, well, we're just going to throw water activity in as a variable because we have it, and it is more direct than moisture content. So it's kind of, I guess, from us, it's transitioned from like the shiny object to the sort of like the solid foundation or the baseline that we're just comfortable standing on, right? So the reality is that transition is I would say really powerful and really speaks highly of what we found the place of water activity to be, but it also kind of means that well, it's not the shiny object so much anymore, and so a lot of our active attention and active digging and research ends up going elsewhere.
And where would you like to see more research when it comes to coffee? And it could have to do with water activity, or maybe something else. Where would you like to see more research emphasized?
Yeah, there are a handful of places. One of these, which is related to water activity, is so as mentioned in the paper in that study that I wrote. We in coffee in particular have the shipment period, and I will say the dreaded shipment period. So we receive samples from suppliers, coffee growers, coffee exporters, co-ops, etc. And we, sample is, if we're lucky, it's this big. And this could represent one full-size coffee bag, or it could represent a full container load. And we're going to assess that sample physically, sensorially, and we're going to cross our fingers and hope that assessment has anything to do with the arrival. And the arrival, of course, happens after the shipment period, which could be, it could be a month. If it goes perfectly, more likely it's 3 months, and it could be 8 months, right? It would have been 5 months, but it got stuck in port on the exit for a month. And then it got stuck in port entering the country for a month. And then there was a strike. And 8 months later, here it is. And huge chunks of that time frame were spent, cooking at sea level in the bottom of a container ship, or sitting in the sun on the back of a train or a truck. The shipment period is this big black box that transforms coffee, even in Grain Pro, even in reefer containers. Scores change, of course. Sensory profiles change, of course. But Moisture content can change over that time period. Density can change over that time period. Water activity changes over that time period. Or it's not so much that it changes, it's just that the sample was not truly fully representative of the whole. That differentiation is a big challenge, right? That's the thing that we were initially, naively, I would say, but initially hoping water activity would really give us greater insight into. So
And
anyone who can solve that.
kind of like the packaging that we talked about earlier, there are some simulations that you could do and kind of understand at least how water activity may be moving down at or around at different parts of the shipment process, and that may be
Sure.
helpful to you. I'll reach out again and maybe see if we
Okay.
can look at that further. What's next
Wonderful.
for you, Ian? What's the next year or maybe next 5 years look like for you at Cafe Imports?
Yeah, so all year this year, and actually just starting say a little bit prior to COVID, so end of 2019 or somewhere in 2019, I started working on what has been a very exciting project. Uh, Reaching back to the question about the sensory certificate from Davis, started working on a update to our cupping protocol and our cupping form, which just this year we started using live internally in our cupping lab, actually in our cupping labs globally, and have started being able to introduce at conventions and shows and out to the world. And so what we've done is taken a check all that apply format, kata format, and we have um, so a kata format is essentially a list of descriptive terminology. It could be descriptive, it could be affective, it could be both. And the user is asked to taste, in our case, some coffee, and they look at this list and they just check the things that apply. So taste the coffee, look at the list, it says chocolate, I agree. You check chocolate and you move on. If the list says lime and you don't agree, you just don't check it. And at the end of the day, you've got this list of things from people and you see what matched up, and there's different ways you can analyze that. Kata is a really fascinating approach because of its sort of hybrid nature, because it is very easy to get into and utilize. But after a while, it was discovered that you could give a kata form, curate what's on it, and you could give a kata form to trained sensory panels, and you could use it as a proxy for a more rigorous descriptive analysis regimen. And so suddenly that makes kata a really interesting place to be, where you have a very low barrier of entry. It's very easy to pick up and learn, but you have a really long usage runway in terms of what you could extract from its use. And so the problem with kata is that it's confined to a list. And so if you want to have, if you've ever read a coffee, if you've gone to the grocery store and picked up a coffee bag or gone to a shop and you've read the description, you know that in specialty coffee we get we get a little funny with our coffee descriptions. We
A
have
little
a high
extravagant,
level,
yeah.
a little extravagant, yes. We'll call it a high level of resolution. And if you want to think of any fancy coffee description and then extrapolate, okay, what would the kata list have to include to fairly include some of this terminology? The list would be massive.
Mhm.
The longer the list gets, the higher the resolution gets, the less usable the kata form becomes. The more you restrict the list, the more usable the form becomes, but the less resolution you have. So what we've done is taken a flavor wheel, which is a tiered structure of, it's a big wheel, it's a sunburst chart that has tiers and category, kind of like pie slices. And we've structured it so that you can take something like, let's call it cooked blackberry. Now, cooked blackberry is a very complex compound term. It comprises a fruit category. It comprises sort of a qualifier, cooked. It comprises a type of cooked fruit, that's berry, and then a specific, that's blackberry. So what we've done is we've tiered a flavor wheel to include each of those building blocks and programmed it into a tablet so that the user can, instead of having to scan a list and say, well, it's not just fruit, it's not cooked berry. It is, but it's more than cooked berry. And then scan. Where's cooked blackberry? There it is. Similar to transitioning from a spreadsheet to a database where you're going to eliminate all the redundant entries, this flavor wheel, because it's set up with building blocks, allows users to build out cooked blackberry or cooked raspberry or fresh citrus or fresh orange without having all of this terminology repeated every single time.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm excited about it. It's a really fun project for us. In any case, we've got this kata form that is dynamic. It's structured on a flavor wheel. The flavor wheel contains, I did this once. It's like 6 or 7 pages, 2 columns, 12-point font, single spaced of terminology, right? Like there's way too much on there, but it fits and it's all logically easy to find because you're building from big to little. And then the kicker here is that, you tap on something, you tap on fruit and the wheel spins around and the fruit category opens up and everything else contracts and you can see what you're doing and you can easily find what you're looking for. The kicker is on a normal kata form, you circle or check the thing that you want to endorse. That's what it's called when you're going to enter or indicate something, you endorse it. On ours, you enter your thing, so fruit, cooked berry, blackberry, and then to endorse it, you indicate an intensity. And by indicating an intensity, that puts us back into the realm of, it's soft, but puts us back into the realm of descriptive analysis as opposed to a preference or affective assessment, right? So we're still focused on, okay, I'm tasting cooked blackberry and I'm tasting it at this intensity relative actually to a generic reference coffee that we're using on every table. So this has been the project. We call this thing the Coffee Rose. It's a software product that we're working on. We've been using it internally. It's super fun to use and the output is great. It captures everything. I no longer have typos or dropped words or things that I just can't read when I'm looking at paper forms. I have this complete capture of everything. The scoring is programmed into it, right? So in coffee, we we describe them with words, but we also give them scores. This is also a weird and interesting thing because coffee score is an interpretation. And so for most coffee scoring protocols, so if you're reading a paper, anyone out listening to this, if you're reading a paper about a study done in coffee and you get to methods and materials and they say they use I'll say it like this. If they say that they use the standard industry protocol or the legacy cupping protocol, what's really important to know about that is that protocol is presented as if it were descriptive, but in fact it is effective. The questions are all set up around, do you think this is good or not? If you look, so you look at a publication, you look at methods and materials, it uses the traditional cupping format. The first thing you need to know is that is actually an effective test, not a descriptive test. So it's not measuring coffee, it's measuring the person's response to the coffee.
Mm-hmm.
And that right at the baseline, it throws a red flag. I actually made a parenthetical in the water activity paper, which I didn't realize this in advance. It came up as I was working on the paper, was that actually the cupping output that most of us use, we've been using, I built a quantitative descriptive analysis form in 2017 that we transitioned to, but prior to that, the legacy cupping protocols that most people are using are really not suitable for this type of analysis that we might want to do, right? We're going to do a longitudinal study tracking quality degradation in coffee. The legacy protocols are not suitable. They're suitable for preference. Do people like this over time? Do people like this or that? that's fine. But in terms of actually talking about what's going on with the coffee, those are no longer, they're not really applicable to that. The rows, I think, is applicable to that. We have, oh, this is where I lost my train of thought on. We have scoring built in to each of the things. So if you think of a sunburst chart, uh, there's all these descriptors on there, and each one is a button. Press the button and you tell the rows something. There's a value associated with that button. What that means is that if I'm in a very good mood on Monday morning and I'm tasting a coffee and I taste juicy mango, I'm going to enter that, and it's going to have the same value as on Thursday when I'm crabby and I taste juicy mango. It's going to be the same. It's going to be the same. So when you tender a coffee sample to me, now suddenly, as long as I can kind of like zen myself up and be focused on the task at hand and say, yep, juicy mango, juicy mango, it's always going to have the same value. There's no room for interpretation. There's no ask for me to do interpretation at the table, right? We're just describing what we're tasting, and then the system itself does the interpretation after the fact. So there you go. That's the project. That's the next year. I think that's the next 5 years, building this thing out, making it available to our customers and anyone who's interested in actually using it. I think there's great potential for people to gain a lot from this, and for certainly for cupping programs to gain a lot from this. We've built in a lot of the kind of nitty gritty, less sexy sensory protocols are built right into the workflow of the system. So.
Yeah, it sounds really interesting and really helpful and user friendly. I'm more familiar with like the wine aroma wheel, but I think the way that you've set this up makes it really helpful for somebody who has to go through this. So I'd be really interested to see it in action. Kind of my last question, I generally ask about any open positions at your company. I saw here that you recently filled several positions, but maybe I'll word it like this. If anybody is listening and they're really interested in sensory analysis, especially the sensory analysis of coffee, what do you recommend to them? What can they do to get better trained or prepare themselves for a career like yours?
Sure. Yeah. So, you can check out the sensory science program at Davis. I will say that sensory science is just like water activity. It's not a silver bullet. It's not a panacea. If I think if sensory science had its way, it would kind of like absorb specialty coffee in this Borg-like, flavorless, dull, boring world where you no longer have beautiful coffees. And so, don't go whole hog there, but certainly a great avenue would be to explore sensory science as a discipline, as a standalone field. And then within the coffee side, definitely keep your eye on our website, our socials, all of that. Cafe Imports remains exciting and dynamic business. We have projects going on all the time, and we continue to grow and hire people and do our best to make opportunities for people, especially if you're interested in sensory and tasting coffee, and think that you have the get yourself in that headspace where you can just come into the back of the building every day and taste a million coffees. Keep your eye on all that stuff, and then turn your brain on when you're tasting food or drinking wine or having a beer, or if you smell something, that's sensory. If you taste something, that's sensory. It doesn't have to be a movie montage of training and whatever. It's just you're always sensing, you're always tasting. It's really a question of turning your brain on while you're doing that. And even if you don't come work for Cafe Imports, that with a little like directed study in the way that sensory scientists do things can take you a very, very long way and really prep you for what you might get to do anywhere.
Well, Ian, I just want to say thank you. We really appreciate you coming on the show. Again, when I saw your study, I thought it was just a really unique approach to something that a lot of people in the industry seem really interested in. And I think this will be really insightful to our listeners. So thank you so much for coming on the show. We really appreciate you.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. It was really fascinating to do the study, and it's really gratifying that after a handful of years here, people are still finding it and reaching out to me. People still, partners of ours, coffee producers of ours, still come up to me and say, "Oh, yeah, I read the study." Oh, okay. I had no idea that's what I was doing when I did that, and so this is wonderful, and I appreciate having the opportunity to chat with you today.
Great. Thank you, Ian. We'll see you again.
I'm Zachary Cartwright. This is Water in Food. Find this podcast on Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.